Dramatization based on veterans' accounts of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, FEB. Snow fell in dirty sheets over a ruined piazza. The air smelled of cold iron and a distant smoke that never quite seemed to lift. In the hollow left by a collapsed wall, a small hand reached out, not to a medic, not to a priest, but to a young soldier who still kept a photograph of his mother folded in the inside pocket of his tunic. He had come halfway around the world with orders and ammunition, taught to move like a machine, to fear and to shoot. Yet in his palm lay something else, a piece of chocolate wrapped in tinfoil, a small luxury he had saved since Rio. He offered it without ceremony. The boy stared, thin as a reed, eyes like an empty room. The soldier peeled the foil. The sound of metal sliding over chocolate was loud in the quiet square. For a moment, both war and duty seemed to stop. There was only that small exchange. The child's fingers closed around the sweet as if he were touching a memory rather than food. A smile, brief, stunned, flickered across his face, and then the boy ate. What the soldier did in that instant was simple. What followed would ripple through a unit and then through a dozen villages. A practice of small mercies that would come to be remembered by locals and veterans alike as the Angeli di Cioccolato, chocolate angels. You won't believe what Brazilian soldiers did when they found war orphans. They fed them, they sheltered them, they risked their lives for them. And in doing so, they changed the shape of a war in ways that were as human as they were tactical. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe for more true wartime stories. He had left Brazil with a dozen other young men. Some of them had never seen snow. On the docks, mothers pressed hands against the hull, eyes bright with fear and faith. The soldier had walked away with a letter from his sister tucked into that photograph, a note that smelled faintly of soap and cassava flour. Training hardened him. The sea made him nauseous and small. He learned how to march in foreign words, and how to patch a uniform so it would not rattle like a signal of weakness. Ships, rail, and then the cold of the Apennines gave him a narrow view of the world reduced to orders and rations. Italy, for many of them, was not a place on a map, but a chorus of sounds and needs. An endless wind under the stars, the crack of artillery, and the sight of homes stripped to their bones. Villages stood like open wounds, roofs missing, ovens cold. Food was a currency as scarce as trust. In villages, children darted like ghosts through rubble, their faces smudged with ash. They had been orphaned by bombardment or separation. Some had watched their parents flee and never return. They wore the war as a second skin. The first encounter was private and small. On a routine patrol through a ruined hamlet, the young soldier paused by a cellar stair where a boy crouched beneath a blanket of rags. The boy's hair clung to his scalp. His cheeks were the color of paper. The soldier could not find words. His Portuguese and the boy's Italian would meet clumsily, like two tired soldiers in no man's land. So he unwrapped the chocolate and held it out. That single chocolate did something simple and profound. It reintroduced an act of normalcy into a world that had been unmade. The child shared it with another child, and then with a woman who showed a gap where a tooth should have been, and the circle widened. The soldier's private mercy, the preservation, in a pocket of his kit, of something that tasted like home, became an invitation. It asked nothing of anyone but recognition, that these children were still children. Word travels in war. News of the chocolate reached other soldiers in the company in small, peculiar ways. A wrapper found in a child's pocket, a softening in the guard's eyes. A whispered story passed during the cold hours when men of different nations tried to sleep. One piece of chocolate could not feed a village, But accounts recall that many soldiers began to share what they had. In mess tins and knapsacks, they kept candy and ration packs, tins of corned beef, packets of manioc flour, sometimes a sweet preserve brought from home, and passed them to children who would not ask twice. This was not a single-night phenomenon. It became a rhythm. A corporal, noticing the ways the children clung to soldiers who came with food, organized a makeshift schedule. One day the cooks would set aside a portion. Another day, men on patrol would distribute sweets. Medics improvised treatments for scabies and fever with what little they had. In one cellar, a sergeant supervised the carving of sleeping platforms so a cluster of orphaned boys and girls would no longer share cold earth. In another hamlet, a group of pracinhas, men who had come as teenagers to fight, painted a crude sign outside a dilapidated schoolhouse that read in broken Portuguese and Italian, "Here we help the children." These were small acts, but in a landscape of ruin, they were gestures against disappearance. The chocolate itself became a motif and a language. It was called in some towns an angel because it arrived unexpected, like grace. Parents and elders, cautious at first, learned to accept the soldiers' offerings. Children came to the edges of bivouacs, carrying empty palms and slow smiles. They began to call the Brazilians by endearments formed from Portuguese or mashed with Italian. Bambino said with a lilt, amido with a crooked-toothed smile. Language softened the edges of occupation. When a soldier said vai and a child answered grazie, the exchange was more than utility. It was the confession of a shared humanity. There were several distinct ways the soldiers extended aid that went beyond sharing rations. One vignette, remembered in veterans' recollections, describes a medic who converted an abandoned barn into an impromptu clinic. He had only basic supplies, threadbare bandages, and a stubborn resolve. He cleaned wounds, dosed fevered brows, and used what little morphine they could spare to bring sleep to an ache. Children who might have died of infections for lack of care were kept alive long enough for the village to recover some measure of normal routine. Another account tells of a group of soldiers who, after clearing mines from a narrow lane, set up a shelter in a ruined chapel. They patched holes in roofs with canvas, hauled straw from fields, and fashioned doors where there were none. They did not, for the most part, adopt children formally. Legal adoptions across borders and war zones are messy and rare. But they created conditions where children could survive, and in some instances, families opened their homes to soldiers who had become like kin. These acts had tactical consequences that commanders did not always foresee. In the fog of war, hearts and minds can be as crucial as artillery. Villagers who received aid often gave what they could in return: information on troop movements, warnings of suspicious activity, a direction to a hidden bunker, or the knowledge that a supply route was blocked. That intelligence could save lives on both sides. Patrols returned with fewer ambushes, and patrols that had distributed food were met with less hostility. The soldiers' reputation as men who helped children softened the bite of the occupation and opened channels of cooperation. Where compassion replaced suspicion, lives were spared. But compassion was not without cost. Soldiers who lingered to tend to a child or to mend a roof delayed patrols. The very act of distributing food could attract enemy attention if done carelessly. There were nights when men who had nurtured a child during the day were woken by gunfire and the realization that kindness offered daylight had become a vulnerability under darkness. Some units lost men who had been loved by the villagers they protected. The memory of those losses threaded every later act of mercy with grief. Yet for many soldiers the risk was worth the moral imperative they felt: to not let the war erase the smallest innocences. Within the company, the practice of looking after children began to form rituals. Men would save small portions of sweet preserves, goiabada slices, or a bar of chocolate from their own rations. They used to joke quietly about treating children better than officers. But the humor was a thin veneer over something deeper: the realization that their cause could be measured not only in conquered ground, but in saved lives. A sergeant, stern and taciturn on the march, would sit with a girl on his knee as if he had always been a father. A young private taught a group of boys how to whistle with a blade of grass. These were not heroic tableaus. They were the small repairs of civilization in a place unmade by war. There were also moments of friction. Some officers fretted over the diversion of supplies. Some locals feared that soldiers' generosity masked larger intentions. And the danger remained: shells, patrols from the other side, the next winter's cold. But many accounts emphasize the practical outcomes. Villages that cooperated with the Brazilians experienced fewer reprisals. A network of trust developed that allowed the wounded to be moved, the sick to be hidden, the children to be fed until peace came. The chocolate was the beginning. The shelter and the massage of a fevered head were the continuation. Years later, veterans would tell of how the distribution of a simple sweet had a cultural afterlife. Children who had been fed by soldiers told their children about the gray men who brought sweets and taught them songs. Some families kept the tinfoil wrappers, pressing them like relics into scrapbooks. In certain towns, a small plaque or a modest monument would remember not only the battles fought, but the hands that reached out to the children in the aftermath. Letters crossed the ocean. A woman in a small Italian town would write to a soldier in Brazil to say thank you. Sometimes myopia of memory blurs details, names misspelled, dates smudged, but the emotional truth survives. The shared sweets created ties that outlived the trenches. One poignant reunion, recounted by both sides in their different ways, involved a man who had been an orphan at the time and the soldier who had once given him chocolate. Decades later, at a modest gathering under a tree where the chapel ruins had been cleared, an older man heard someone call his childhood nickname. He turned and found the soldier, older, with a limp from a wound he had never fully explained, holding a photograph of that exact moment. The chocolate piece in a small palm. They embraced with the awkwardness of men unused to public tenderness. The orphan, now a father, had brought his own children to meet the man who had been a small miracle in his life. The soldier's eyes brimmed. Memory had survived in letters, in gatherings, in the way a child's smile can embed itself in a life. These after-war ties were not rare anomalies. Many units kept correspondence with families they had passed through. Some soldiers received bread and olive oil in return, sometimes a jar of preserves sent across the ocean as a sign of gratitude. Others returned to those villages years later as part of veteran pilgrimages, facing the ruins they had once helped to mend. Monuments rose in a few places, modest stones with dates and the names of the fallen, but also images of a soldier bending toward a child, a relief that made visible the small human acts history can overlook. It is important to keep the story honest. Not every soldier behaved in the same way, and not every village welcomed them. The accounts we have are partial and selected, but the pattern is persistent enough in veterans' testimonies to suggest a cultural tendency among many of the Brazilian troops, an inclination to protect children, to share what little they had, and, in some cases, to risk their mission to save another life. The chocolate was symbolic, but also practical. It was a rare, morale-boosting luxury that could be parceled out in a way that food could not. A broken man may not be moved by a biscuit, but the sweetness of chocolate is immediate. It says, in a basic language, "You are seen." Over time, the symbolism became part of how both veterans and civilians remembered those days. In private letters, an old soldier would write of the comfort he felt knowing he had once offered a child something that tasted like home. In villages, parents told their children about the Brazilians who taught them a new song and fixed an oven. The chocolate wrapper, a marginal object, became a memory anchor that tied together countless small lives. Where an entire history might otherwise focus on maneuvers and line changes, these domestic stories insist on a different metric of worth. How many lives were warmed by a small, deliberate kindness? There were administrative obstacles to long-term support. Once peace returned, many of the shelters and informal clinics were taken over by returning civilians, or they simply dissolved under the pressure of rebuilding. Orphans that had found temporary refuge with soldiers often had to be integrated into extended families or local institutions. Some children emigrated later, others remained. A few veterans worked quietly behind the scenes to secure legal adoptions or to send funds home. More commonly, they kept the bonds alive through letters and occasional visits, a human web spun thinly across continents. Wartime compassion left scars as well as warmth. Men who had reached toward children to soothe them sometimes carried guilt. They had seen the price of mercy in comrades lost while giving aid. Some veterans spoke of a persistent ache, a private accounting of favors given and favors owed, of faces that never stopped haunting them. The moral weight of protecting innocence amid violence pressed on them long after bullets had stopped. Yet many said, too, that those small acts had made the war bearable. In the shelters and the improvised clinics, and in the simple handing over of a wrapped chocolate, they had found reasons to keep moving forward. From a distance, these stories also changed how communities regarded the foreign soldiers. Where suspicion had been the immediate response to arriving troops, the rhythm of repeated care altered perceptions. Town councils and local leaders who saw pragmatic benefits, safer roads, fewer reprisals, better trade prospects, began to collaborate. Some village women taught the soldiers how to make simple dishes with local ingredients. In return, a soldier shared a Brazilian song, its rhythm sticking like a grain of new memory. These exchanges were not grand reconciliations, but small, day-to-day negotiations of trust. They shifted the moral landscape in ways that mattered for the people living through them. There is a hard edge to the narrative, because compassion cannot erase the fact of battle. The Brazilian units fought in difficult conditions. Snow and mud, cold and stones, all added a cruelty to the days. Men died in distant ravines and on ridgelines. Their absence was a wound in every heart. The acts of kindness toward children existed alongside measures of duty, reconnoitering, holding lines, respecting orders. The narrative is not meant to romanticize. Instead, it aims to reveal that humanity can persist even when systems around it are designed for destruction. When the war finally eased, farewells were improvisations of grief. Children clung to soldiers' legs, envelopes of dried fruit clutched in their hands. Some orphans followed the departing columns for a little way, then stopped as the tail of the formation turned and the nation that would receive its sons on the other side of the sea dissolved into the horizon. In the aftermath, many came to know the bitterness of absence. A wrapper in a pocket, once a token of kindness, became a relic of loss. The epilogue of this story is not a tidy reconciliation. It is a slow, ongoing process of remembrance. Some veterans returned decades later to find villages rebuilt and children grown into parents. They sat at tables with the descendants of those they had once fed, and they shared bread and laughter. The chocolate, now a memory told to grandchildren who could not imagine a world without supermarkets and easy sweets. In other places, the memories were preserved in letters that yellowed with time, in small plaques on church walls, or in occasional reunions organized by local associations. Where monuments exist, they do not go on front pages. They are small stones with names and a few words about care given when it was needed. The final scene returns to the ruined piazza under a different light. Years have passed. The chapel, patched and warm, hosts a crowd. A veteran, hands scarred and steady, listens as a woman, once a child, now a matron with grandchildren, tells a story about a man who gave her chocolate when there was nothing else. She holds up a wrapper that had been flattened in a book. The crowd chuckles and then sobers. Memory has the curious power to make the past present. For the soldier, who had never imagined he would be remembered for the small mercy of a chocolate bar, the moment is strange and profoundly right. What did the Brazilian soldiers do when they found war orphans? They shared what little they had. They set up places to sleep where there had been only cold floors. They bandaged fevered brows. They did not change the course of history alone. They could not undo the violence that had created the orphans. But they did make the difference between being unseen and being seen, between starving and being fed, between wandering and having shelter. In a war measured in kilometers and maps, they measured victory in a different currency, the preservation of human dignity. If this story moved you, share in the comments a moment when a small kindness changed your life, and check the description for links to accounts, archives, and organizations that preserve these histories. In the end, the little act of offering a wrapped piece of chocolate becomes a symbol of a larger truth. In the midst of devastation, the choice to be humane is itself a kind of victory. The heroism of war is often told in strategies and flags, but sometimes the most lasting triumphs are quieter. A warm hand extended to a small palm, a shelter built with rough boards, a wrapper saved as proof that someone was there to care. That is what the Precinhas left behind, not a myth of glory, but a legacy of compassion. They went to fight, they found children, and in the small work of feeding and sheltering them, they discovered that preserving human dignity can be the most courageous thing a person can do.